Entire worlds walked out of the peace talks. The Galactic Council panicked. The translator bead in my ear was already screaming by the time I reached my seat. Not screaming in the way machines scream. It was doing that stuttering, clicking, overcrowded thing it does when too many species are talking at the same time in too many frequencies for its processors to keep up. I had been wearing that bead for 11 days straight, and I had learned to read its moods. Right now it was telling me the same thing the room was telling me: everything was about to go wrong. My name is Maya Osei. I am Earth's diplomatic representative to the Galactic Council, and on the morning everything fell apart, I was 34 years old, running on 4 hours of sleep, and holding a thermos of coffee that had long gone cold. The Conclave of Worlds is a station that orbits a neutron star. It was built there on purpose. The idea, 400 years ago when the Council's founders chose the location, was that neutral ground should be uncomfortable for everyone equally. They were not entirely wrong. The radiation shielding on the station is excellent, but you feel the pull of that dead star in your chest, like a hand pressing gently but constantly against your ribs. Most species find this deeply unsettling. The Kelvathari, who are made of something that functions like crystal and live for thousands of years, once described the sensation as standing at the edge of eternity. The Vos Imperium delegates, who are large, scaled, and deeply invested in projecting confidence at all times, simply never mention it. I, personally, found it tolerable. Humans have a gift for tolerating things. The chamber where the talks were held was enormous. The ceiling curved up and away like the inside of an egg, and the lighting shifted throughout the day to accommodate species that saw in ultraviolet, infrared, or frequency ranges that do not have human names. The table in the center was not one table. It was a series of surfaces at different heights, different temperatures, different material compositions, all connected by a central hub where the Secretary General of the Galactic Council stood and tried to keep order. Her name was Vel Harith. She was Philosophy, tall, slow-moving, with a face that communicated about 1% of what she was actually feeling at any given moment. She had been mediating galactic conflicts for 200 years. In 11 days of talks, I had watched her visibly age. Earth had been a member of the Galactic Council for 40 years. That sounds like a long time until you realize that most of the species in that room had been members for 300, 800, or in the case of the Kelvathari, over 2,000 years. We were the new ones. The young ones. The species that had shown up with nuclear reactors and enthusiasm and a deeply human inability to understand when we were not welcome. The conflict that had dragged us into the conclave was not our war. It had started as a border dispute between the Kelvathari and the Vos Imperium, over a stretch of space that both species considered historically, spiritually, and strategically essential. It had grown over 3 centuries to involve the Drauvek Concord, a species of insectoid beings who operated as a collective intelligence spread across 600,000 individual bodies, and who had gotten pulled in when their trade routes were disrupted. 17 smaller species had been absorbing the costs of all 3 conflicts in destroyed shipping lanes, collapsed colonies, and trade routes that simply no longer existed. Earth had 3 colonies in the affected zone. We had gotten lucky, in the grim way that luck works in war. Our colonies had been disrupted but not destroyed. We were at the table because the Council needed a representative who had skin in the game but no historical allegiance to any of the 3 major powers. We were there because we were new and neutral, and because no one had yet learned whether that was an asset or a liability. My aide, Kofi Arden, was 26, from Bristol, and had a mind like a filing cabinet that had somehow become capable of independent thought. He sat to my left, always slightly forward in his seat, always watching the room the way a person watches a fire that they are not sure is contained. On my right was our translator specialist, a woman named Petra Lund, who had spent 12 years learning Kelvathari tonal language and described the experience as trying to learn music through a wall. The Kelvathari sat across the chamber from us. There were 9 of them, which was a small delegation by their standards. They were tall and still, and when the light caught them at certain angles, they refracted it in a way that made them look like they were glowing. Their lead diplomat was named something that Petra had translated, approximately, as resonance through deep water. For the purposes of my notes, I called him Resonance. He had not once, in 11 days, acknowledged me directly. The Vos Imperium delegation was 7 strong, all of them in formal armor that was technically decorative but clearly functional, all of them radiating the particular kind of stillness that very large, very proud beings radiate when they are forcing themselves not to react to something. Their lead negotiator was called Commander Diplomat Groth. Groth had a voice like a rockslide and used it sparingly. The Drauvek were 3 bodies, all of them absolutely identical, all of them sitting completely motionless except for the occasional synchronized blink. Their collective mind processed the room in ways that made every other species in the chamber quietly uncomfortable. They did not negotiate. They observed, calculated, and occasionally delivered conclusions that were so precisely accurate that they stopped conversations cold. That morning, 11 days in, the talks were stuck on resource distribution rights in the contested border zone. This was, technically, the central issue. But the real problem was what it had always been: none of the 3 major powers trusted the others enough to agree to anything that required them to give something up first. Every proposal went in circles. Every compromise was met with a counterproposal that undid the compromise. Vel Harith had the expression of a person watching sand pour through her hands and being unable to stop it. Kofi leaned over to me at 9:30 of that session. He smelled like exhaustion and whatever the station's cafeteria had been serving that morning. He said, quietly, "They're going to walk out again." He meant the Kelvathari. They had walked out twice already during the 11 days of talks. Both times it had been over procedural issues, the order in which species were recognized to speak, the placement of a dividing element in the chamber that the Kelvathari considered a subtle insult to their spatial customs. Both times, Vel Harith had spent hours in backroom negotiations and the Kelvathari had returned the next morning as if nothing had happened. It was a tactic. Everyone knew it was a tactic. No one said so, because in galactic diplomacy, knowing something and saying it are very different categories of action. I watched Resonance. He had gone very still in a way that was different from his normal stillness. His crystalline surface had shifted, subtly, in color. Petra had told me early in the talks that Kelvathari color shift was involuntary and communicated internal states they could not control. The color Resonance was shifting toward was one she had described as the frequency of a decision already made. I said to Kofi, "Yes. But this time it's different." He looked at me. Different how? I did not have an answer yet. I just knew. 11 days of watching a room teaches you things that you cannot always name. 20 minutes later, Resonance stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a gesture. He simply stood, and the 8 other Kelvathari stood with him, and he said, in the harmonic tone that Petra translated with a slight catch in her voice, "The Kelvathari collective withdraws from these proceedings. The conditions for honorable negotiation no longer exist." And then they walked out. Not as a protest. Not with the theatrical quality of the previous 2 exits. They walked out the way a tide goes out, steady, inevitable, complete. The doors closed behind them with a sound like a held breath releasing. The chamber was silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then Groth of the Voss Imperium stood up, because the Voss will follow the Kelvathari out of a burning building if it means they can claim they were not the last to leave, and said, "The honor of the Voss Imperium cannot be sustained at a table the Kelvathari have found unworthy." The 3 Drauvek bodies flickered simultaneously, like a light source with an unsteady connection. Then they rose, wordless, and followed. By the time the echoes of 3 different sets of footsteps had faded, the chamber contained 17 small delegations, Vel Harith, and us. Kofi stared at the empty seats. His voice, when he found it, was very quiet. "Maya. Earth Command is going to tell you to leave." "I know," I said. "Are you going to?" I picked up my cold coffee, found it was still cold, and drank it anyway. "No," I said. Kofi looked at me the way people look at someone standing in the rain without a coat, not quite understanding whether to be concerned or impressed. Petra was already pulling up emergency protocol briefings on her tablet, her fingers moving fast. Around us, the 17 small delegations were whispering to each other, casting glances at the door and then at us, unsure what the human diplomat sitting calmly in her chair was going to do next. Vel Harith met my eyes from across the chamber. In 200 years of her face communicating almost nothing, I saw something move through it then. Not hope. Not quite. Something smaller and more careful than hope. I set my thermos down and opened my notes. The first communication from Earth Command arrived 9 minutes after the walkout. It came through on the secure channel, flag Priority 1, and the message was short enough that Kofi read it to me without blinking. "Ambassador Osei. The situation at the conclave has been assessed. All major powers have vacated. The talks are considered collapsed. Please proceed with dignified withdrawal and await further instruction. Do not engage in independent action. Kofi lowered the tablet. He did not say anything. He was very good at not saying anything when he understood that anything he said would be wrong. I read the message myself. Then I set the tablet face down on the surface in front of me and looked at the room. The 17 small delegations were still there. Some of them were clearly preparing to leave, papers being gathered, whispered conversations happening in the back rows, aides moving toward doors. But none of them had left yet. Every one of them was watching me. Petra said, quietly, Maya, if Earth Command is calling this a collapse and ordering withdrawal, there are procedural implications for staying. We could be considered to be acting outside our mandate. Our mandate, I said, is to represent Earth's interests in these proceedings. These proceedings have not been formally closed. Vel Harith has not declared them suspended. The session is still technically open. Petra opened her mouth, then closed it, then said, that is a very narrow interpretation. It's an accurate one. I stood up. Not dramatically. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood, the way a person stands when they intend to stay in a room for a while, and I walked to the central hub where Vel Harith was still standing with the expression of someone who had lived through many disasters and was watching one more unfold. She looked at me the way a person looks at something unexpected but not unwelcome. Ambassador Osei. Secretary General Harith. The session is still open. In technical terms, she said, yes. In practical terms. Practical terms can wait. I would like to make a motion. She was quiet for a moment. 200 years of experience moving through her like deep water. Then she said, the floor recognizes Earth's delegation. I turned to face the room. 17 delegations in various states of departure. All of them stopped. The Galactic Council's founding charter, I said, grants equal voice to all recognized member species in open session. This session is open. I move that the remaining delegations be formally invited to present their positions, not as supporting voices to the major powers, but as principal representatives of their own interests. The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. Not empty. Full. A delegate from the Murith, a small, soft-spoken species from the outer rim who had been at the back of this chamber for 11 days without being asked a single direct question, leaned forward in her seat. Her name was Counselor Desi Pharaoh. She had been taking notes every day, careful and meticulous, on paper that she brought from home, and I had watched her watch the major powers the way a person watches a flood from a hill, out of reach, unable to stop it, waiting for it to end. She said, very carefully, in translated standard, you are asking us to speak. I am asking the council to allow you to speak, I said. As the charter intended. Vel Haritha's expression shifted. This will be interpreted as provocation by the departed delegations. Probably, I agreed. But it's legal. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then, with the slow, deliberate movement of someone making a decision they know will have consequences they cannot yet calculate, she said, motion accepted. The floor is open to all remaining delegations. The silence broke. Not all at once, carefully, the way ice cracks before it gives way. Delegates who had been halfway to the door turned back. Aides began pulling out documents that had been prepared and never used, briefings that had been written in the long, hopeless hours of watching the major powers talk past each other. My second communication from Earth Command came in while the first minor delegation was preparing to speak. It was longer than the first message. The tone had shifted from instructional to alarmed. There were words in it like unprecedented and unauthorized and serious diplomatic risk. There was a sentence near the end that said, very clearly, Ambassador Osei, you are one person representing a 40-year-old council member. Please do not attempt to carry this alone. I read it. I put it down. I picked up my pen. The delegate from Murith began to speak. Her name in full was Desi Pharaoh, and she had been a counselor for her people for 18 years. She had watched 3 of her planet's 6 main trade corridors close in the past decade due to the ongoing conflicts. She had watched 2 of her planet's colony stations be declared unsafe due to proximity to the contested zones. She had written, she said, 47 formal petitions to the Galactic Council over the past 6 years and received responses to 11 of them. She did not speak dramatically. She spoke the way a person speaks when they have said the same thing many times to people who did not listen, and they are deciding, one more time, to try. Her voice was steady. Her data was precise. The translator bead in my ear was, for the first time in 11 days, working without a struggle. Other delegations began producing their own documents. The Hishari had lost records going back 60 years. The Dolvan Confederation had population displacement figures that the major powers had never referenced in any session. The Canthari, a species so small that their table surface had to be adjusted upward every morning, had a proposal for a resource-sharing mechanism in the contested zone that had been submitted to the Council 3 years ago and never put on the agenda. Kofi was beside me, pulling up comparative data on his tablet, cross-referencing claims against the Council records we had access to. After about an hour he leaned over and said, very quietly, Maya. Their numbers are right. All of them. Everything they are saying can be verified in Council records. Someone just never looked. Someone never had to, I said. Outside the chamber, the Galactic Council's administrative staff had stopped pretending to work. The security personnel who monitored the session feeds had apparently stopped rotating in and out because the feeds were showing something none of them had seen before. We found out later that the Council's public broadcast system, which normally required a formal motion to activate during closed-door talks, had been switched on by a junior archivist who simply could not believe what she was watching and thought the galaxy should see it. By the time the third delegation finished speaking, the feed had gone out to 47 inhabited systems. By the time the eighth delegation presented, it had reached 212. My third message from Earth Command that day was not an order. It was a single sentence from the Secretary of External Affairs, a man named Director Owen Calloway, who had been in galactic diplomacy for 30 years and had, on several occasions, told me I was too stubborn for my own good. His message said, I have no idea what you are doing, but do not stop. I was not planning to. What I did not know yet, what none of us in the chamber knew, was that in his private quarters on the departing Kelvathari transport, Resonance was watching the same broadcast feed that 212 star systems were watching. And in the Voss Imperium's shuttle bay, Groth had not yet ordered his ship to depart. And in the Drauvek network, spread across 600,000 minds, a single, shared observation was being processed and reprocessed like a stone turned over and over in a current. The stone was this: the human stayed. None of them had expected that. The fourth day after the walkout began with a message I did not expect. It came through the Council's formal channel, routed through Vel Haritha's office, marked as a private communication. The sender was identified as a junior protocol attaché of the Kelvathari Collective. His translated name was something Petra rendered as Harmonics of the Second Dawn, and she said the phrasing of his message in Kelvathari tone language carried the particular register of someone who had been told very specifically what to say and was trying very hard to say only that and nothing more. The message said, the Kelvathari Collective has noted with interest the continuation of sessions at the Conclave. We have concerns regarding the direction these sessions have taken. We request a private channel for clarification. Kofi read it over my shoulder and said, they are watching the feeds. Yes. And they do not like what they see. They are not sure yet whether they like it or not, I said. That is different. He thought about this. Is it better or worse that they are not sure? Better. Certain people are predictable. Uncertain people are reachable. I did not respond to the Kelvathari message immediately. This was a deliberate choice. Not a game, I do not have the patience for games, but a simple calculation. The Kelvathari had spent 900 years of recorded history establishing that they operated on their own timeline. Responding within the hour would signal that I was eager. Eager, in their diplomatic framework, meant weak. I responded 4 hours later, between the morning and afternoon sessions. My message was 6 sentences. It said that the sessions at the Conclave were open to all member species as guaranteed by the founding charter, that Earth's delegation welcomed the return of any departed party, that private clarification channels were available at the Council's discretion, and that I looked forward to continued dialogue in whatever form best served the peace process. I said nothing about their concerns. I did not ask what they were. I simply left the door open and said nothing about it. Petra read my response before I sent it and said, "You are not acknowledging their concerns." No. They will notice that. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are very strange for a diplomat, Maya." "I have been told that," I said. The morning session that day was led by the Hishari, who presented their full 60-year impact record in organized sections, with visual data that their delegation head, a quiet, methodical man named Counselor Bright Emeka, had clearly spent years compiling. He was not a dramatic speaker. He did not try to be. He simply laid out what had happened to his people, year by year, as a direct consequence of a conflict they had never chosen and never been asked about. At one point he put up a chart showing the population of a Hishari colony station over 50 years. The line went steadily up for 30 years and then, at the point where the contested zone fighting intensified, dropped sharply and never recovered. He did not editorialize the chart. He simply showed it and moved on. There was not a sound in the chamber. Outside, I was told later, the broadcast had by now reached over 400 systems. The Council's communication office was being contacted by media organizations from species that were not even Council members. The administrative staff were running out of precedent. There was no protocol for what to do when a session of minor delegations, called on a motion by the youngest Council member, became the most watched diplomatic event in 40 years. The Council's emergency governing body, a committee of 12 senior administrators called the Presiding Circle, called an emergency session of their own that afternoon. They met without the major powers and without the minor delegations. They met by themselves, in a sealed room, to discuss whether what Earth's delegation was doing was within the bounds of its authority. Vel Harith attended. She came back from that meeting with an expression that had, for the first time in 11 days, something in it that was not exhaustion. She found me in the corridor outside the chamber during the afternoon break, standing alone with my cold coffee and a view of the neutron star through a shielded porthole. She said, "The Presiding Circle has reviewed Earth's motion and its legal basis." I said, "And?" "You are correct. The Charter supports it." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, the Presiding Circle is also concerned about the reaction of the major powers when they fully process what is happening here. The Voss Imperium has already released a statement." I had seen the statement. It called the minor delegation sessions a theatrical disruption of legitimate diplomatic process and an attempt by inexperienced parties to restructure the governance architecture of the conclave. It was careful language. Precise language. The kind of language that was written by people who knew they were on record and did not want to say something they could not take back. "The Voss statement has made things worse for them," I said. Vel Harith looked at me. "400 systems are watching," I said. "Most of them are minor species. The Voss just called the people they are watching theatrical. That is a word people remember." She considered this. "You anticipated that response." "I thought it was likely." "And you let it happen." I turned from the porthole. "Secretary General, I did not engineer the Voss Imperium's communication strategy. They wrote their own statement." She held my gaze for a long moment with that face that showed almost nothing and somehow showed everything. Then she said, "The Kelvathari have requested a private session." "Not with the Council. With you specifically." "I know. I responded to their attaché this morning. They have escalated the request. It is now coming from Resonance directly." The Kelvathari lead diplomat, who had not acknowledged my existence in 11 days, was now asking to meet me specifically. I kept my face calm. On the inside, something clicked into place, the particular feeling of a key turning in a lock you did not know was locked. "Tell Resonance I am available tomorrow morning," I said. "Before the session opens." Vel Harith said, "The Voss have also made a request." "For a private session?" "Yes." "Also directed at you specifically?" "Not the Council." "You." "Tell them tomorrow afternoon." And the Drauvek network has transmitted a query through their standard channel asking whether a private channel with Earth's delegation is procedurally available. I looked at her. "Tomorrow evening." She was quiet. Then, very carefully, she said, "Ambassador Osei. What are you doing?" I finished my cold coffee. I looked out at the neutron star, that dense, burning, impossible thing that sat at the center of everything, pulling at us all. "I am doing what someone should have done 40 years ago," I said. "I am making people talk to each other one at a time, when they are not performing for each other." The second message from Kofi came in just as I turned from the porthole. He was in the data room, cross-referencing the Canthery resource-sharing proposal against the Council's own historical records from the contested zone. His message said two things. First, the Canthery proposal was technically sound and addressed the core resource dispute more directly than anything the major powers had proposed in 3 years of pre-conclave negotiations. Second, the proposal had been submitted to the Council's Agenda Committee 14 months ago and marked, deferred pending major party consensus. It had been sitting there. Available. Correct. Unseen. Not because it was hidden. Because no one powerful enough had thought to look for it. I forwarded Kofi's message to Vel Harith with one line added, "Please ensure this is in the session record for tomorrow." She confirmed it 2 minutes later. That night, for the first time in 4 days, I slept more than 4 hours. I set my alarm, closed my eyes, and did not dream of the chamber or the neutron star or the empty seats where 3 great powers had decided the room was not worth their time. I dreamed of nothing, which is its own kind of luxury. When I woke up, there were 14 messages waiting. 3 from Earth Command, 2 from Council Administration, 4 from media organizations somehow routing through channels that were supposed to be closed, 1 from my mother who had apparently seen a broadcast and wanted to know if I was eating properly, and 3 from delegations I had not yet spoken to who wanted to know if they could present their data before the formal sessions ended. I answered my mother first. Then I got dressed, made coffee from the small supply I had brought from home because the station's version tasted like heated metal, and went to meet the oldest diplomat in the room. Resonance was waiting in a small side chamber off the main corridor. His 8 colleagues were not with him. Just him, and 1 aide who stood near the door with the specific stillness of someone who was there to listen and report everything they heard. The room was cool and neutral, lit in a spectrum that split the difference between what humans and Kelvathari found comfortable. He looked at me for a long time before he spoke. I looked back. In Kelvathari social code, sustained eye contact is not a challenge. It is an acknowledgement. It means, I see you as someone worth seeing. I had read this in the briefing documents. I had not been sure whether to use it, because using a cultural gesture incorrectly can be worse than not using it at all. But I held his gaze, and after a moment, his surface shifted, that involuntary color change, moving toward something Petra had told me translated approximately as recognition. Earth's delegate, he said, in his own language, which my bead translated with a slight harmonic delay. You remained. Yes, I said. We did not expect that. I know. Another silence. Resonance had lived for what Petra estimated was close to 3,000 years. He had been in more negotiations than I had years of life. I did not try to fill his silence. I had learned, in 11 days, that the Kelvathari use silence the way some species use speech, as a carrier of meaning. Interrupting it was rude in ways that could not be entirely recovered from. He said, finally, the sessions you have conducted with the minor delegations. The data they have presented. We have reviewed it. It is in the public record, I said. Yes. A pause. We were not aware of the Hishari figures. Nor the Canthery proposal. I did not say, you could have been, at any time, because it was all available. I did not say, you did not look because you did not think you needed to. I did not say any of the things that were true and would have been damaging to say. I said, the Canthery proposal addresses the core resource question in the contested zone. I think it is worth examining. It is a proposal from a species with no military capacity and no historical stake in the zone, Resonance said. It is a proposal from a species that has been living adjacent to the zone for 300 years and has had to find ways to function despite the conflict, I said. That is a different kind of stake. He was still. The color at his edges shifted again, toward something Petra had once described as the frequency of reconsideration. There is another matter, he said. Yes, I said. There is. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and in the space between us was the thing neither of us had said yet, the reason his people had walked out 4 days ago, the real reason, the one that had nothing to do with procedural dishonor or seating arrangements. How long have you known? He asked. I suspected on day 8, I said. I confirmed it when you walked out. You did not say anything. No. Why? I thought about the honest answer for a moment. Then I gave it. Because if I had said it in open session, the talks would not have survived the hour. And the talks are what matter. Not being right. He was very still. Then, in a tone that my beat translated with the specific harmonic register that Petra had once described as the Kelvathari equivalent of respect given without wanting to give it, he said, "What do you want from this meeting, Earth's delegate?" "I want you to come back to the table," I said. "Not today. Not with a statement. Quietly. I want you to look at the Kelvathari proposal and find 3 things in it you can support. And I want you to trust that the thing you walked out to protect does not have to become public for the problem to be solved." The silence that followed was very long. His aide by the door had gone absolutely motionless. Resonance said, "You are asking us to trust a 40-year council member. I am asking you to trust a person who has had 4 opportunities to cause you significant damage and has not used a single one," I said. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I will review the Kelvathari proposal." It was not a yes. But it was not a no. In 3,000 years of Kelvathari diplomatic language, Petra told me later, it was close to a yes as it was possible to get in a first conversation. I thanked him, which he received with the slight color shift that meant acknowledgement, and I left the room. In the corridor, I leaned against the wall for a moment and let out a long, slow breath. The neutron star was invisible from here, but I could feel its pull in my chest, that constant gentle pressure. I had gotten used to it over 11 days. It had started to feel, almost, like a heartbeat. Kofi was waiting for me around the corner with 2 cups of the station's metal-tasting coffee and the look of a person who had been awake all night reading documents. "How did it go?" he said. I took the coffee. "We are not done yet." "I know. But the VOS session is in 3 hours, and I found something in the council records last night that you need to see before you walk into that room." He handed me a tablet. I read what was on it. Then I read it again. Then I said, quietly, "Kofi. This changes everything." He nodded. "I know. I think it is also why the Drauvek left." I stood in that corridor with the neutron star pulling at my chest and the most important document in 40 years of human galactic diplomacy in my hands, and I understood, finally, what the shape of the next 3 days had to be. We had a long way to go. But we were still in the room. There is a document in the Galactic Council's records called the Boundary Compact of the Third Age. It was written 900 years ago, during the last major reorganization of contested space in the galactic rim. It is 14,000 words long, written in the formal register of 3 different species legal traditions, cross-referenced with 612 territorial maps, and stored in the Council's deep archive under a classification that roughly translates as foundational precedent, settled. The word settled is doing a great deal of work in that classification. Because Kofi had found, in his night of sleepless document review, that the Boundary Compact contains a clause, Article 77, Section 4, a single paragraph that runs to 48 words in standard translation, that establishes joint administrative oversight of a 7-system corridor in the current contested zone. Joint oversight not between the Kelvathari and the VOS, who had been fighting over that corridor for 3 centuries. Joint oversight between the Council itself and any 3 member species with active presence in the corridor. The Kelvathari and the VOS were both in the corridor. So was a species called the Murith, small, quiet, the delegation whose councillor Desi Pharaoh had been the first to speak in the minor sessions. 3 parties. Active presence. The clause was technically in effect. It had been in effect, by the letter of the compact, for most of the past 3 centuries. No one had invoked it. Whether because no one knew about it, or because invoking it would require the major powers to acknowledge a governance framework they did not control, Kofi could not determine. He suspected the latter. I suspected he was right. The meeting with Groth of the VOS Imperium that afternoon was different from the meeting with Resonance. Where Resonance had been still and measuring, Groth was present and physical in the way that very large beings often are. He filled the room not aggressively but simply by existing in it completely. He had removed the formal decorative elements of his armor for the private meeting, which Petra said was a significant gesture. It meant he had come to talk, not to represent. He looked at me for a moment when I entered, and then he said, without preamble, in the blunt translated standard that the VOS preferred for direct conversation, "You know about Article 77. I sat down across from him. "Yes." Kofi Arden found it in the records. "Yes. We found it 14 months ago, Groth said. I kept my face calm. 14 months. Before the conclave. Before the pre-session negotiations. Before the talks had even been formally scheduled. We found it, he said, and we determined that if it became known, it would complicate our position significantly. The Kelvathari were aware of the clause as well. We had agreed, informally, to ensure it did not enter the discussion. That is why you both walked out, I said. The Drauvek, he said, have approximately 600,000 minds capable of processing archival data simultaneously. They found it during the 5th day of the talks. They communicated their discovery to us privately, through a back channel. They asked whether we intended to disclose it. We said no. They said they could not remain at a table where known relevant precedent was being withheld from the formal record. And they left. They left, Groth said. We did not expect it. Kelvathari and I had an agreement. We were not prepared for the Drauvek to act on principle without warning. I looked at him. He met my gaze with the kind of directness that large beings sometimes have, no evasion, no deflection, because they are powerful enough that they have never had to develop those habits. Groth, I said, why are you telling me this? He was quiet for a moment. Then, because you have had 3 days to make the broadcast public. You have had 3 days to contact Earth Command with a discovery that would give your government significant leverage. You have not done it. No. You are not going to expose it in open session. No. Why not? I said, because exposing it destroys the people who need to use it. The Murith. Desi Pharaoh's people. If Article 77 comes out as a scandal, the Kelvathari and the Voss become victims of a procedural trap rather than parties to a solution. The negotiations collapse permanently. The minor species lose the only piece of legal protection they have ever had in the contested zone, because the major powers spend the next decade fighting the precedent in council courts rather than implementing it. He was very still. The clause exists, I said. It is valid. It does not have to be weaponized to be used. It can simply be introduced as the framework for the next phase of talks. Voluntarily. Jointly. By all 3 parties who are legally party to it. You are asking the Voss Imperium to voluntarily enter a governance framework we spent 14 months suppressing. I am asking the Voss Imperium to enter a governance framework that already applies to you by the law you helped write 900 years ago, I said. I am asking you to do it in a way that looks like leadership rather than concession. Silence. Groth looked at his hands. They were large and scaled and resting flat on the table, and he looked at them the way people look at things they are deciding about. The Kelvathari, he said finally. You have spoken with Resonance. This morning. And Resonance is reviewing the Canthari proposal. He agreed to Article 77. He did not disagree to it. Another silence. Longer. The pull of the neutron star was in the room with us, that quiet persistent pressure. Groth said, if we return to the table, it cannot appear that we returned because we were outmaneuvered by a 40-year council member. It won't, I said. Because you were not outmaneuvered. You made a choice. You found a document. You chose not to use it as a weapon. You chose instead to return to the talks and present it as a foundation. That is not defeat. That is statecraft. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, you are very unusual. I have been told that, I said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, Earth has 3 colonies in the contested zone. Yes. The Canthari proposal does not address colony protection specifically. No, I said. But I believe it could be amended to do so. I would be prepared to present such an amendment jointly, if there were other parties willing to co-sponsor it. He met my eyes. Something moved through his expression. That rock-slide voice was silent, but his face said something that translated, across species and centuries, as a person recognizing when they have met someone who has thought several steps further ahead than they expected. I will speak with my legal team tonight, he said. Thank you, I said. He stood, which in Voss custom closes a private meeting more definitively than any verbal statement. I stood as well. He looked at me one more time, and then he said, very quietly, Ambassador Osei. The broadcasts. Yes. The Voss statement we released. About the minor sessions being theatrical. Yes. It was poorly worded, he said. Coming from Groth, Petra told me later, that was an apology. It was noted, I said, which was, in diplomatic language, acceptance. The meeting with the Drauvek that evening was not a meeting in the traditional sense. The Drauvek do not meet. They receive. I sat in a small room with 3 bodies that were simultaneously present and elsewhere, and I spoke, and they absorbed what I said the way a vast body of water absorbs a stone, completely, without displacement, incorporating everything. I told them what I had told Resonance and Groth. I told them what Article 77 meant for the Murith. I told them what the Canthary proposal contained. I told them that I needed, when the major powers returned to the table, something from a source with more computational credibility than a 40-year council member. I needed the Drauvek network's formal analysis of the Canthary proposal's technical viability. The 3 bodies were still for a long moment. Then one of them said, in unison with the other 2, in the particular tonal flatness of a collective mind translating itself into individual speech, we have already completed this analysis. We completed it 11 days ago. We were waiting for someone to ask. I stared at them. You had the analysis, I said. Yes. For 11 days. Yes. And you did not share it. No one asked, they said. In council procedure, unsolicited data from a non-principal party requires a motion from a recognized delegate. No motion was made. I closed my eyes for 1 second. 11 days. The full technical verification of the solution had been sitting in the Drauvek network for 11 days, and no one had made a motion to ask for it. I am making the motion now, I said. Noted, they said. We will have the formal submission to council records by the morning session. I stood to leave. At the door, one of the 3 bodies spoke without the others, slightly out of the synchronized rhythm. It said, in a slightly different tone, something that might have been individual rather than collective, the humans stayed. I paused. We calculated, when the major parties departed, that the probability of the talks producing any agreement was less than 3%. We revised our calculation when you did not leave. We are still refining our model. What is the current probability? I asked. A pause. 41%, they said. And rising. I thanked them, which 3 minds processed simultaneously, and I walked back to my quarters through corridors that smelled of circulated air and distant stars, and I sat down at my small desk and I wrote the most important message of my career. It was not to Earth Command. It was not to Vel Harith. It was to Desi Pharaoh of the Murith. It was short. It said, your people's rights in the contested zone are not a favor that the major powers can choose to give or withhold. They are written in law that predates this conflict by 6 centuries. I need you to know that before the session tomorrow, because when that document is entered into the record, I want you in the room when it happens, and I want you to know exactly what it means for your people. She responded 20 minutes later. Her response was 3 words. We will be there. The session the following morning began at the standard opening time, with Vel Harith at the central hub and the 17 minor delegations in their seats, and Kofi beside me with the Drauvek analysis loaded and verified, and Petra with her translation equipment checked twice, and me with my thermos and my notes in the particular calm of a person who has run out of fear and found something steadier on the other side. The major delegation's doors opened at 8 minutes past the hour. The Kelvathari came first. 9 of them, Resonance at the front, moving with the tide going out steadiness that I had now learned to read differently than I had 11 days ago. They took their seats without statement. The Voss delegation filed in 2 minutes later. Groth looked at no one in particular and sat down. The Drauvek took their seats at 11 minutes past the hour, and the moment the third body settled, the synchronized stillness of 600,000 minds was back in the room with us, and the chamber was whole again for the first time in 4 days. Vel Harith looked at the room. The room looked back at her. Then she looked at me, and something in her face, that face that had been showing almost nothing for 200 years, showed, clearly and unmistakably, relief. She said, the session is in order. We have new material for the record. Kofi submitted the Drauvek analysis. I submitted the text of Article 77 with a formal motion to enter it as operative precedent. Desi Pharaoh of the Murith raised her hand, in the human gesture she had picked up from watching me over 11 days, and asked to speak. Vel Harith recognized her. And she spoke. She did not speak dramatically. She never did. But this time the room was not a room where small delegations waited patiently to be ignored. This time it was a room where a document had just been entered into the record that made her people legally co-equal administrators of the zone they had lived beside for 3 centuries, and she knew it, and the room knew it, and every broadcast system in 460 star systems was carrying her voice, steady and precise and unremarkable, the voice of a person saying the true thing that everyone should have said long before now. What followed took 11 more days. Not because the agreement was easy. It was not easy. The Kelvathari and Voss legal team spent 4 days debating the specific wording of the Article 77 implementation framework. The Canthari proposal required 6 amendments before it satisfied all parties, including the colony protection language that Groth and I had agreed to jointly sponsor, which caused 2 days of its own procedural debate. The Drauvek submitted 47 pages of technical analysis for the resource-sharing mechanism, which had to be read and verified and translated and read again. But no one walked out. Not once. I had a conversation with Resonance on the 7th day of the final phase. A brief one, in a corridor, not scheduled. He stopped beside me while I was reading a document, and I looked up, and he said, in his tonal language that the bead translated with the slight harmonic delay I had come to know, Earth's delegate. I have a question. Yes, I said. On the first day we departed. You did not follow. Every other delegation was prepared to leave. You stayed. Why? I thought about the honest answer for a moment. There were several true answers, and some of them were complex, about the charter, about the minor species, about Article 77, about the calculation that someone needed to hold the room until the room could hold itself. But the truest answer was simpler than any of that. I said, where I come from, we have a phrase. It is old, and it has been said in many different forms over many centuries. The version I grew up with goes like this: the person who stays in the room is the person who gets to decide what the room becomes. He was very still. Then the color at his edges shifted to something Petra, when I described it to her later, was quiet about for a long moment before she said, that frequency means something very specific in Kelvathari emotional language. It means the feeling of recognizing wisdom in an unexpected place. I was not sure I was wise. I was sure I was stubborn. In my experience, the two are often difficult to tell apart from the outside. The Conclave Compact was signed on the 42nd day of the talks. 22 species. 4 major powers. 1 framework that addressed the core resource dispute, established joint administrative oversight under Article 77, protected the colony systems of the minor delegations, and created a standing mechanism for the minor species to raise concerns directly to the Council without requiring a motion from a principal party. Buried in Appendix 7, in language so dry it barely qualified as interesting, were trade protections for 3 Earth colonial systems in the contested zone that Earth Command had given up on 3 years ago. I had not given up on them. At the signing, Vel Harith stood at the central hub and made a brief statement. She spoke about the process, about the participating delegations, about the importance of the charter and the strength of the compact. She did not single anyone out, which was correct diplomatic form. Afterward, in the corridor, she found me. She said, "You will be asked to write an account of this process for the Council's historical archive." I know. What will you say was the turning point? I thought about Desi Farrow taking notes on paper she brought from home. I thought about Kofi awake all night in the data room. I thought about 3 Drauvek bodies telling me they had been waiting 11 days for someone to ask. I thought about Resonance and his tide going out walk and the color that meant a decision already made. I thought about the neutron star pressing against my chest every morning, and the cold coffee, and the thermos from home. I will say, I said, that someone stayed in the room. She nodded. That is all. That is everything, I said. On the transport back to Earth, Kofi slept for 14 hours straight. Petra organized her notes. I sat at a small window and watched the stars pass, which are different from how they look from the ground, not scattered but layered, depth within depth, species and histories and wars and agreements all threaded through the same ancient light. Director Owen Calloway from Earth Command contacted me 6 hours into the journey. He was brief, which was unusual for him. He said, "The Secretary of State sends her formal commendation. The Council seat has been elevated from observer participant to full voting member." I am told this is the fastest elevation in council history. 40 years, I said. 39.5, he said. The compact counts as accelerating our probationary standing. He paused. Then he said, I told you, once, that you were too stubborn for your own good. You did. I was wrong, he said. You were too stubborn for everyone else's comfort and exactly the right amount for everyone's good. That is different. I thanked him. He disconnected. I turned back to the window. The stars did not care about the distinction. They had been there before the conclave and would be there after, burning through their own private timelines, each one with its own pull, its own gravity, its own way of keeping the things around it in motion without touching them. I had been asked, later, in interviews and briefings and the council's formal debrief, many times, what Earth's strategy had been. What the plan was. Whether the series of conversations and motions and document discoveries had been carefully engineered from the start. I always told the truth. There was no strategy. There was a charter, and a thermos, and a room that needed someone to stay in it, and a species too new to galactic politics to know that staying was supposed to feel like losing. No one fully believed me. I did not correct them. Diplomacy, I had learned, is partly about letting people build the story that lets them live with the outcome. If the galaxy needed to believe that humanity had played a deep game, then the galaxy could believe that. The outcome was the same either way, 22 species, 4 major powers, 1 room, and nobody walking out. That was enough. On the last night of the journey, I dreamed of the conclave chamber, empty, the way it was very early in the mornings before any delegation arrived, the light cycling through its spectrum for an audience that had not yet arrived, every seat waiting, the table at different heights and temperatures and materials, all of it ready. In the dream, I was the only one there. And then the doors opened, one by one, and they all came in. Every delegation. Every species. Some of them still carrying the old arguments, the old grievances, the centuries of unfinished business that does not disappear because a document is signed. They all came in. They all sat down. The room was full. I woke up and the stars were outside the window,